Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners, wherever you may be around the world. Today, we have a true treat for you. Author of Any Given Tuesday, A Political Love Affair, Lis Smith, who is also a prominent Democratic communications specialist, strategist, campaign ace. She has worked for Andrew Cuomo, former governor of New York, former governor Eliot Spitzer. At one point, as a youngster, she worked for John Edwards on his presidential campaign. And then most recently, most prominently, she crafted and worked with Mayor Pete Buttigieg at the time, now Secretary of Transportation, to help lift him from mayor of South Bend to a national name that ultimately got tapped for the Secretary of Transportation role. Please give this a hearty listen as we're going to get into everything political midterms, political communication strategy, and also please consider buying her book, Any Given Tuesday, A Political Love Affair. So, Liz, I wanted to first welcome you here with us. We understand you're on a writing deadline, so we appreciate you carving out some time to speak with us.
No, I appreciate that. But as you guys know, when you're on a writing deadline, you pretty much want to do anything in the world except to write. So this is a great procrastination tool for me.
So, Liz, we're going to talk, I think, quite a bit about the strategy that you developed and deployed for Mayor Pete Buttigieg, then Mayor Pete Buttigieg. It kind of made you a star in the political communications world. And I think that a fair way to characterize what you did was almost flood the zone with Mayor Pete. You put him on so many interviews and in front of so many cameras that the public had no choice but to pay attention to him and learn who he was. And, you know, I was interested in how this strategy might have only worked with a candidate like Mr. Buttigieg, that it was really tailored to him. And you clearly had a lot of trust that he could go on all these interviews and all these different environments and perform well. And I kind of want to ask you about that. Do you think that that strategy could have worked for the other candidates in the field, people like then Senator Harris?
There may be a couple candidates who could have pulled it off. Another candidate who had a similar strategy was Andrew Yang. Actually, you saw him doing a lot of the media that we were doing and doing a lot of sort of unconventional media that really helped him sort of build up the Yang gang following. But generally not, it is very much an approach that was tailored to Pete. And on any successful campaign, you can't really paint by the numbers. You have to have a strategy that is tailor-made for your candidate. And having a very media-forward strategy was tailor-made for Pete because he's just like a beast when you get him, on a podcast or in front of a TV camera or in a radio interview, whatever it is. So it was very much tailored to what we knew were his strengths.
So, Liz, if you were working for the Harris campaign, how would you have organized that one? What would you have done with the media strategy?
So I got to tell you, there were 20-something candidates in that race, and I spent 25 out of 24 hours a day just focused on Mayor Pete. So I can't really speak to the strengths or weaknesses of other candidates. And a lot of this comes from, a lot of how I developed this media strategy for Pete was because I had worked for him for years before the presidential race, and I had really gotten to know him. So it's really hard for me to say, as someone who has only met Kamala Harris in passing in a hall, or behind a debate stage, it's really hard for me to say this is how I would have run her campaign. But she was someone who really did shine in some of those Senate hearings and clearly was fairly good at prosecuting the case. That's sort of how you get elected as a DA. That's how you get elected as an attorney general. And finding more opportunities to be in those situations where she's sort of more in her comfort zone are things that I might have emphasized. What that means in terms of tactics, I don't know, maybe more town halls, things like that. But I'd have to think a little bit more on that one.
So no strategy is perfect, Liz. And you mentioned that your strategy was tailor-made to Secretary of Transportation. What a great title now. Pete Buttigieg, who's going around the country with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, has a lot of accomplishments to tout. What were some of the weaknesses, if any, that you can point out of doing this type of media strategy where you're just getting him everywhere? And it did win wide acclaim from Democrats. So I need to preface it with that.
Well, when you're out there all the time and you're giving so much access, it does increase the likelihood of fuck ups, right? It increases the likelihood of screw ups from the candidate, of gaffes, and misquotes. So let me give you one example. We sort of tried to revive, and we did revive the John McCain strategy from, that he made really famous during the 2000 election of the Straight Talk Express, essentially where you have a bus with the candidate and you fit as many reporters as you can on it and create an all access, all on the record environment. So it's a real free for all sort of environment. And it's one thing to do it in 2000 when you didn't have social media, when you didn't have like Wi-Fi. Very different thing to do it in 2019, 2020 when we did it. And a lot of people thought I had lost my mind, which, I probably lost my mind long before that because, every utterance could be tweeted out. If he had said something dumb in the moment, it would be all over the wire, all over cable news, before we could even go to the next stop. Luckily, he didn't really have any of those moments. But there was one moment when the LA Times popped a story. They really badly misquoted him, but it was hours and hours and hours of audio for us to comb through and to find, okay, well, where is this quote from to be able to help correct it? And the quote bounced halfway around the internet before the LA Times could correct it the next day. So that sort of shows you some of the downside of it, that if you have someone who's out there all the time, that one, they could say something that qualifies as a gaffe, but two, you could be misquoted. And because there's such a volume of audio that you have to comb through, it's a lot harder to correct the record than if your candidate's just giving like one 5-minute interview that day.
Justin mentioned that Mr. Buttigieg is now Secretary Buttigieg. And it reminds me of a question that then Mayor Buttigieg had to answer a lot. But now that we have a couple years separated from the campaign, I kind of want to ask you, which is, did the mayor run for president with the absolute intention of being president in January 2021? Knowing how big of a field it was, knowing how running a campaign has helped elevate people's national profile and help launch them into all kinds of other important, impactful positions. Can you tell us whether or not there was one goal to become president in the Buttigieg campaign?
There was only one goal, and it was for him to end up in the Oval Office. And I think you would have to be a truly, truly sick individual to undertake a presidential campaign without that ultimately being your goal. And I know sometimes people say, well, maybe they're aiming for vice president, maybe they're aiming for a cabinet position. But to run for president, to go through that grueling schedule, to spend all the time schmoozing donors, shaking hands, going to coffee shops with maybe only 5 people in it, and then having to do a 3,000 person rally, and one day talking to Iowa Farm Radio about ag subsidies, and then the next day you're talking about an infrastructure project in Charleston, South Carolina. To be able to do all of those things, you really have to have a certain certitude within you that you're the right person for the job. Otherwise, I just don't really think you could have what it takes to successfully run a presidential campaign. One of the reasons why Pete was able to do so well was because he was running for the big prize. He wasn't looking to come in second or third or fourth place and like, ooh, maybe I raised my profile by running for president. He was running because he wanted to be president, and he wanted to be president because he thought he was the right person for the moment that we were in.
So, Liz, you say that for someone to run for another reason, they would have to be sick. Let's leave, Secretary Buttigieg out of it. Do you think that some of the others are sick? Because it's hard to look at all the candidates that ran the last several cycles on the GOP and Democratic side and say, none of these people were running for any other reason than to be president. I mean, you mentioned Andrew Yang already.
But I do think that Andrew Yang believed that he was the right person for the moment, that he had fleshed out an economic agenda that was meeting the moment, and that he should be president. I do think that. I mean, I have some questions maybe about Marianne Williamson, but we're also talking about Marianne Williamson. She hawks crystals and stuff like that. So, but for the other people, even the candidates who didn't last particularly long, like Seth Moulton or Eric Swalwell or Bill de Blasio, Yeah, I absolutely think that when they woke up in the morning and looked in the mirror, they saw a future president looking back at them.
I forgot that Seth Moulton ran. We had him on the show and he was fantastic and so candid. He said Nancy Pelosi rules with a dictatorial flair, but maybe we need that in the House at this moment. And this was before all the legislation passed. I don't know why I'm reminiscing down memory lane about Seth Moulton, but it's word association. I got to ask you a quite candid question here. My background is in the GOP, and then I became a Democrat in like 2018. But I have friends across the political spectrum, and I tend to have a lot of progressive friends who are consultants and work in similar fields to us. Simply put, why do they hate Mayor Pete? Like, there is some serious vitriol. It's not all progressive voters. It's within the consultant class. There seems to be some type of animosity. I was hoping you could put your finger on it so that I can laugh at them and tell them this is why they're feeling this way.
I think there are a couple things and a few different reasons. And I speculate about this with other people who worked for Mayor Pete and reporters. And I think it's rooted in a few things. A lot of people in the sort of political consultant class happen to be contemporaries of Mayor Pete, right? And they see this guy sort of going from nowhere to being, pretty close to winning the nomination. He won the first contest, which was bananas, considering most of these consultants didn't even know his name when he jumped in the race. And so I do think that there is an element of natural human and also professional jealousy when you see a contemporary of yours while you're like sitting in your pajamas on your couch, like, up there at a rally winning Iowa. So I think that's an element of it. Then there are people who thought he was sort of a generational traitor, right? That he wasn't not as edgy and progressive as what they thought a 38-year-old candidate should be. And that he was, a boomer in elder millennials clothing. So that was definitely an element of it too. Like with any politician, you're not everyone's flavor. And there were people who I think thought he was maybe a little too perfect, a little too polished in, his debate answers and what he said on TV, and sort of like too much of a perfect little boy for them. And I think that turned some people off. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I can't really speak to all that, but those are some of the reasons that I have, heard from people and that I've sort of seen in, some of his haters. But it's a real thing. The Buttigieg derangement syndrome is a real thing, and it still rears its head from time to time on Twitter.
So for full disclosure for our lovely audience here, I went from working the RNC with Trump in 2016 to get him elected to favoring Mayor Pete at the time, now Secretary Pete, as my preferred candidate because I thought he had a winning message. But more importantly, he came across as somebody that took democracy seriously. And having been up close enough up front with a Tea Party member at the time in Congress as a policy advisor and then the RNC, it just seemed like he was the antidote to a lot of what ails us, which is substance and taking the process very seriously. So I need to put that disclaimer out there and not ask you only softball questions. I got to ask you, what should Secretary Pete, if he were to run again, what should he do differently to increase his share of Black voters?
Yeah, and this was one of the things that Pete probably got criticized for most, and he got a lot of attention in the press for not really being able to attract a ton of support in the Black community. I will say the attention that was paid to this relative to Mayor Pete was a little bit unfair, because if you look at the polls, there were essentially no other candidates who were able to really make a dent with Black voters, because I think we all underestimated. By we, I mean, Democrats working for all but one candidate, and the media all underestimated just how rock solid Joe Biden was with Black voters. That's why the Biden campaign didn't really get shaken by, finishing fourth or whatever it was, fourth, fifth in Iowa and New Hampshire, because they knew that they had a wall in South Carolina, that they had a firewall there, and that Black voters would turn out in big numbers and overwhelmingly support him. So, it's not like Elizabeth Warren or Amy Klobuchar or even before they dropped out, Cory Booker or Kamala Harris, it's not like they were, making huge inroads with Black voters. But you're right. Pete was a candidate who was not able, despite, some of our best efforts, to make much in the way of inroads there. And some of that, I think, is a function of the fact that he went into this race completely unknown. Some of it is a function of the fact that Black voters have heard a lot of smooth talk from fresh-faced candidates, empty rhetoric that then turns out to not produce any results for their community. So they are rightfully more skeptical of, a Pete-like candidate because of that. And third, Black voters are really pragmatic. And we really saw that during the primaries. Like, their number one concern was not like, do you support Medicare for all versus Medicare for all who want it, and all these sort of quaint seeming debates. All they cared about is, can we nominate someone who will beat Donald Trump? And more so, I think by and large, that was a big concern for Democratic voters. But it was a dominant issue for Black voters. And, across the board, voters saw Joe Biden as probably the most electable candidate against Joe Biden. And I think Black voters were right that Joe Biden probably was our strongest candidate that cycle. But now Pete's getting out there. He's getting more well-known. He's obviously doing a lot of work with Black elected officials, Black communities across the country as he's going and talking about infrastructure. So if in the future, one day he decides to run for office, I think sort of all the hard work he's doing now could potentially pay off.
So it's potentially something as simple as winning Iowa, winning our home state of New Hampshire. And then I was actually shocked. We had John Ralston of The Independent on from Nevada. I was shocked at how low the turnout was in that. So even winning Nevada, and then that solves all of Pete's ailments, or will he have fundamentally different type of platform and message because of the experience that you so rightly pointed out of him traveling to these communities, for example, where there will be new piping for water put into place because of the bipartisan infrastructure bill? Is it more just him winning and having name recognition, or altering the message and policies?
I don't think that he even knows whether he'll ever run for office again, whether it's the White House or any office. So I don't want to get too over our skis here and start making predictions there, but it'll be fascinating to see what the Democrats do with the primary schedule. I suspect they'll keep New Hampshire in the mix. Iowa, I don't know what's going to happen there. All signs point toward Joe Biden being the nominee in 2024. And 2028, 2032, it's hard enough to plan 2 months in advance, especially given the craziness of our politics. So I just really cannot tell you what any of us will be talking about years from now.
So, Liz, when you were answering Justin's question about why the progressives were not supportive of then Mayor Buttigieg, you mentioned his age and that fellow millennials were unhappy that someone of their generation was having this success. And I think you're right. And I was thinking about how often we talked about his age. It was so often discussed in the context of that campaign, and still today. I was thinking about this, he's 40 years old. And if we look at other leaders around the world, I mean, Rishi Sunak, incoming leader of the UK, 42. Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, 42. Emmanuel Macron of France, 44. Sanna Marin of Finland, 36. Incoming leader of Italy, Meloni, she's 45. Gabriel Boric of Chile, 36.
John likes foreign affairs, if you couldn't tell.
You lost me like 10 people into that list. I just totally spaced out. But I heard El Salvador, so keep going. Sorry.
Nayib Bukele of El Salvador, 41. The question is really just, it's normal around the world for a leader of his age to become the head of government or the head of state. Why is it such a big deal in the United States? Why do we talk about it so much more here than in so many other places?
I don't know. And hopefully that changes. And hopefully that changes one day when it comes to the White House. Hopefully that changes with respect to congressional leadership. And again, I'm not like a sociologist. I'm not a psychologist. I try to avoid getting into too deep thoughts. I'm just a political hack. But it is a problem for the political system in general and for Democrats that we sort of are a party of older, that is like where the faces of leadership are generally, people in their 70s, 80s. And it would be really, really, really smart for Democrats, even if they don't like elevate, a 30 something year old or early 40s member of the House to be their leader, to start elevating them more and develop more sort of like a team based approach where, yeah, you can have Nancy Pelosi as the speaker or whatever, but use people like Alyssa Slotkin or Abigail Spanberger or Colin Allred, put them in meaningful posts or use them as faces of the party on national TV and in national dinners, whatever it is. But we do have to do a better job of doing that, because especially for the Democratic Party, we've always branded ourselves as the party of the future. When you think about John F. Kennedy running in 1960, or when you think about Bill Clinton running in 1992 or 1996, or Barack Obama running in 2008, they ran and they succeeded because they ran as candidates who were looking toward the future, and they looked like the future because these are all guys who are 42, 43, 44 years old. And Democrats do very well when we elevate new, energizing young voices. So I don't know why it is that in American politics we sort of lag the rest of the country in that. And I would say it's not unique to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party has some problems here as well, but it is something I would like to see be changed for sure.
And for the Republican Party, who may have some younger folks, they're folks formerly Madison Cawthorn, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and we can go on and on. So they're young folks probably they don't want in office, as opposed to what you're saying there. But I did want to get into your ballywick, Liz, and pick up on, for example, Rep. Slotkin, and take a step back from Pete Buttigieg's strategy, Secretary of Transportation, and now get into Democrats' strategy and how we should view the elections. This episode's coming out Thursday. We have an election in 4 days from publication, 5 days from publication, something like that. So when we see fundamentals where we have the party in power is the Democratic Party, and in midterms, typically that's historically awful, as our listeners all know, but also we're coming out of a global pandemic and we have global inflation, although not as bad in the United States as the rest of the world, still a focus. Gas prices are maybe too high. The fundamentals are just really bad. So, and I'm trying to make this as specific as possible because general questions kind of suck. For a district like Rep. Slotkin, or where I'm from in New Hampshire's first with Chris Pappas. So basically 2 swing districts that, have the blue collar workers that the Republican Party is all jazzed up about. Is it possible for those type of candidates in an even matchup to overcome the fundamentals? Or is at some point the fundamentals just so bad that you could run the perfect campaign and still lose?
Both. Both. So there is one unique dynamic in Michigan, a dynamic that is very Michigan specific, that is working to Alyssa Slotkin's advantage. And that is the fact that they literally have abortion on the ballot there. There's Proposition 3, which, if voters support it, would overturn a 1931 law that bans abortion in all instances and would send, doctors, women, girls to jail for an abortion. So that has helped. Abortion is one of the few issues right now where the majority of voters trust Democrats more than they trust Republicans, and where Democrats are much more in the mainstream than Republicans are. And we certainly saw that in Kansas, right? Where, the wording was a little bit different, but we saw Democrats turn out, Republicans also turn out to vote down a measure to ban abortion in the state. And that some of that energy is continuing going into November. And that's part of the reason why you see Sharice Davids absolutely romping in some recent polls. And if you dig into the polls, you'll see why. Because unlike the other polls at the New York Times, I think over the weekend, looked at 4 different House races that they said should be swing districts. And only in Sharice David's race was abortion the top issue for voters. And why is it a top issue for voters? Yes, she comes from a district where the majority of voters are college educated, and this is going to be a more important issue for abortion is going to be more top of mind for voters than the economy, right? Because if you're college educated, you're affluent, inflation's going to be impacting your life maybe a little bit less. And so you can care about issues like abortion. But in districts where inflation is by far and away the number one issue, it's a much, much tougher environment for Democrats. So Alyssa Slotkin, it's a little bit harder to universalize that. But what we're seeing generally for these candidates is the ones who are succeeding are the ones who didn't just put sort of all their eggs in the basket of, communicating about abortion, and who understand that it is really, really important to meet voters where they are. And that means that you are talking about economic issues. You are talking about gas prices. You are communicating proactively on crime. And let me give you an example of a Democrat who is basically running a perfect race, but is very unlikely to win on Tuesday. And that is a friend of mine, Tim Ryan in Ohio. He's doing everything that a Democratic candidate should be doing to try to win in a Republican state like Ohio, a state that Donald Trump won by 9 points in 2020. And if Donald Trump won it by 9 points in 2020, that should be a place where Democrats absolutely get slaughtered in a midterm. But why Tim has managed to keep the race close is because he's someone who can go everywhere. He's gone to every county. He doesn't just go to the blue areas. He goes to the reddest areas because he understands that there's Democrats have an arithmetic problem there. There just simply aren't enough Democrats where if you run up the margins, you can win. You have to be able to convert some Republicans to your side. That is your only path to victory. So that's why you see him going on Fox News. You see him doing a lot of, right-wing radio in state. You see him in the reddest counties because, you know what? If he can take some of these red counties from 80-20 down to 70-30 or 60-40, whatever it is, and add up enough of them, that could, define the margin for him. And he's someone who also is breaking with the National Party on things. He said he doesn't support Joe Biden running again in 2024, that he's going to be a pain in Chuck Schumer's ass, that he agrees more with Donald Trump on trade than Barack Obama, that he is pro natural gas exploration. And he's someone who, if you think about the caricature of Democrats, right, that they are the party of people who are more comfortable in factory lounges than on factory floors, he busts through that stereotype, right? He's a guy who does look more comfortable, drinking beers in a VFW or a Union Hall than he does at a big dollar fundraiser with donors in San Francisco. And, John Fetterman, I would say, is another Democrat in that sort of vein. And JD Vance has been running a piss poor campaign. I mean, that guy is lazier than a three-toed sloth. And he is doing the opposite of Tim Ryan and really just sort of doing the bare minimum of campaigning. And why he's been able to get away with that is because of the fundamentals. And my fear is that Democrats might take away some of the wrong lessons from this election and say, well, oh my God, look, everyone on Morning Joe and all these people David Axelrod or Lis Smith said Tim Ryan was running this great campaign. And that shows that these centrists or moderates or whatever they like to call us have no idea what they're talking about. And we need to run the furthest left progressives to energize the base. And that should not be the takeaway from this election. The takeaway should be that, first of all, there's no one way to be a Democrat. How we were even able to keep it close in some of these states and win in some of these states or keep it close and make sure that we didn't lose by 20 points or whatever. Because keep in mind, Tim is outperforming the Democratic gubernatorial candidate by 12 or 15 points. And how he was able to do that was not by checking the box of every progressive litmus test. It was by running a campaign that was sort of unique to Ohio, where he realized that if he had any shot at winning, you had to reach out to Republican voters, and that there is no one way to be a Democrat. And that if we don't want to cede states like whether it's Ohio or Iowa or, some of these other states that Democrats have been able to win in recent years, that we need to understand that we need to give the Democrats there some latitude to break from the national party and, break with some of the, lefty policy positions like Medicare for all, Green New Deal, et cetera, et cetera.
So I just wanted to say that that's for the progressive, that's definitely going to be their takeaway. And you know that. Regardless.
I know. That's why I said it. Because I'm already saying it.
Heads I win, tails I lose.
Think about this. Okay, we get through the 2018 election. Democratic turnout is through the roof. Republican turnout was also really high. I think that 2022 across the board is going to be even higher. We picked up all these seats in Abigail Spanberger, Mikey Sherrill, Andy Kim, Colin Allred. And the story of 2018, Lauren Underwood. And these are all people who ran on Obamacare and the economy. That was it. They didn't run hair on fire things. They weren't super leftist, whatever. And they were able to flip red districts. And the takeaway should have been wow, maybe we should run younger, dynamic candidates who just sort of talk like normal people, don't adopt these super weird lefty positions, and that's how we'll win. But instead, the big takeaway in the media and in some parts of the Democratic Party post 2018 was well, look at what AOC did, look at what Ilhan Omar did, look at what Rashida Tlaib did, and this is proof that the Democrats need to move completely to the left. And it's no, you guys, those are all deep blue districts, the districts we should be looking at. And I understand it's not as sexy, it's not as provocative, but the candidates we should be looking to are the Alyssa Slotkins and Haley Stevens and the, Elaine Luria's, not the people who won in Democrat plus 40 districts. Sorry, end rant.
But we just hit on, there's no one way to be a Democrat after we talked about that dirty word, which I like to call progressive. But we also hit on how abortion is going to help candidates that have to face the issue up front, i.e. Michigan, where it's literally on the ballot, Kansas, where Sharice Davids is. It's absolutely insane to think that she may hold her seat, which was Kevin Yoder's seat, who was viewed as the future of the Republican Party in the Kansas 3rd, Johnson County. My boss was in Kansas 1st. If you were consulting right now on federal candidates, I know that you have some state work going on in Michigan. What would be your advice on how to message for inflation? Because there's a huge schism in the Democratic Party. And more specifically for our listeners, there's a few different ways you could do it. You could pivot and attack Republicans. You could explain this is global inflation and it's nothing we can really handle. Or you could try and give solutions, maybe some less as harebrained as the progressive Bernie Sanders solution, which is to say it's corporate greed. We need to increase taxes at a time of inflation. So how would you go about advising your standard House candidate, no matter where they're from, and I know location matters, on how they should approach this issue?
Yeah. And look, it certainly depends on whether you're an incumbent or a challenger. But what I would say is, one, meet voters where they are. Say, I feel your pain. I understand that inflation is a big issue for you and a big issue for your family. Two, talk about what Democrats are doing or what they're trying to do, right? Creating good jobs, infrastructure jobs, allowing Medicare to negotiate for lower drug prices, capping the price of insulin, capping seniors' out-of-pocket healthcare costs. That's a difficult one to say. And what are Republicans doing? They're not offering any solutions to help you or your family. All they are doing is trying to play the blame game. And to the extent that any of them have articulated an economic agenda, should they take back the House or Senate, it's that Social Security and Medicare are on the table. It's that they want to make the Trump tax cuts permanent and maybe even expand them. So if you are, working middle class family, these people are going to do nothing for you. And I'm trying and I'm working on it. And these will be my priorities if I'm elected. So I think you really do have to make it a choice. And if we just get into, thinking abortion's going to win this for us, or just letting or just sort of defending our accomplishments without trying to define the Republicans, we're screwed. That's one of the reasons, I worked for Barack Obama during 2012. I was his director of rapid response in that election. And he went out there and he defined Mitt Romney as too extreme on issues like abortion, sure. But he also went out and every day prosecuted the economic case against him, saying, I understand, unemployment's still too high. I haven't helped the country. We haven't recovered completely from the recession. But this is what Mitt Romney has done in his career. And this is the bad stuff that he will do if you elect him president. So making the choice is clear is really, really important for Democrats.
So, Liz, here's another question about media and communication strategy for the Democrats right now. So there's been quite a bit of reporting that suggests that President Biden himself is quite eager to go out and do more interviews and have more press availability. And that reporting also suggests that his communications team are very reluctant to go ahead and do this, that they take an approach more like shielding or protecting the president from the press. This kind of goes along with what we were saying earlier in the talk tonight about your strategy with then Mayor Buttigieg. How would you approach this if you were in the White House comms team? Would you advise President Biden to go out and do more interviews, or would you side more with the staff that want to keep him a bit closer?
So I haven't, full disclosure, I haven't seen this story. I don't know how well sourced it is, blah, 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 all the usual caveats. But I don't think that putting Joe Biden out there a little more is the worst idea in the world. One thing I do talk about in my book, Any Given Tuesday, was the 2016 election and how the Hillary Clinton campaign made a very big miscalculation. They thought that if they just held her back, didn't put her out there in the media, and let Trump go out every day and say outlandish things, that would automatically win the election for them. Because, Donald Trump would be so horrifying and say so many crazy things that voters would be turned off. But it ended up, working out a little bit differently because Trump flooded the zone so much. It was really hard for any of these gaffes to really penetrate because one day he's saying this crazy thing about bombing this country. Another day he's mentioning the size of his hands 30 times to the Washington Post Ed board. Another day the Access Hollywood tape comes out. That by the end, it's so exhausting. It's so hard to keep up with these things. And you're none of these things ends up really penetrating. And then on the flip side, you have Hillary Clinton that when she goes out, if she does, one press conference every couple months, and let's say she makes a gaffe in there, that gaffe has forever to marinate and reporters can really seize on it. And sometimes if you play hide the candidate or hide the elected official a little bit with the press, it can lead to that sort of dynamic where when they do go out, if they don't say everything perfectly, everyone jumps on it. They define them by that. But it also creates a cat and mouse dynamic with the press where the press feels like, okay, well, you're not going to answer our questions. Well, we're just going to go out, write our own narratives, and they're sure as heck not going to be favorable to you. And I understand that Joe Biden is not this, the smoothest talker in the world, but that's always sort of been part of his appeal. He's like Uncle Joe. He's the guy from Scranton. And most people don't go out and, give speeches like Barack Obama. Most people don't go out and give interviews like Pete Buttigieg. Most people, myself included, have speaking styles that have a lot more in common with Joe Biden than they do with Pete Buttigieg and Barack Obama. And so I do think that's part of his appeal, and that, maybe people would focus a little less on a misstatement here or there if he's just going out there and talking a little more often, because, then it sort of normalizes it. So I understand. I'm not in the White House. I don't know the dynamics. I didn't even read that story you're talking about. I understand sometimes the reticence or the sort of the hesitance of people to put their candidates out there, but sometimes it's unwarranted. One other thing I would say is, and again, I didn't read the story, but some of their hesitance might be rooted in the fact that in general, it's not helpful to have your president out there that much in a midterm election, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, whether you're Joe Biden in 2022 or Donald Trump in 2018. Because for a lot of these candidates, they want to localize the race as much as possible and not sort of get sucked into the referendum on Joe Biden.
Or President Obama in 2010. God forbid we were to ever experience a red wave like that again in my lifetime. But I think that you and I experienced the 2016 campaign entirely different. And I hear you talking and I can picture you being a rapid response director. But the Trump campaign leaned on the RNC to do all their work because they had, quite frankly, mainly idiots in Trump Towers in New York, but also they just didn't really staff up. So I was a research person creating the narratives and then giving them to our surrogates, but also giving them to the Trump campaign so that they can get into speeches and start hitting Hillary Clinton on her 30 or 40 year record in public office. So we had literally binders filled of things going back decades from the Hillary Clinton healthcare initiative. And whenever she wasn't out there, we were able to draw upon this, put out surrogates, email the New York Times, for example, and Maggie Haberman and other reporters, and just get that stuff out there. Even if the mainstream outlets were refuting it, it was still a criticism that was filling the void, so to speak. And I think your point about not talking perfectly and talking more like, for example, my words, Tim Ryan, than Secretary Buttigieg, is that Donald Trump has proven that. He says some crazy shit, and he says it horribly, like windmills are going to give you cancer, and his cadence is all fucked up, and his spacing and his words. But voters forgive him because they understand what he's trying to get across, as hateful as it may be. So I just wanted to juxtapose our experiences there and how happy I was on election night, despite knowing I would never work for that freak Trump in the White House. So I just wanted to lay that out there.
Well, it speaks to the dynamic. I think I say this also in my book, is like, if you don't feed the beast will feed on you. We certainly saw that play out with the Clinton campaign in 2016.
Justin, I think you're getting into a pretty common habit of depicting Trump as this political Superman. You're saying voters forgave him for all these misstatements, but I mean, he did lose. And not only did he lose the presidency, but also the House and the Senate in only one term, which no one's ever done before. So I'm not, I think all those misstatements and controversial statements came back to bite him. I'm not sure that it's really true that voters forgave him, is it?
He beat the prediction of like every person in politics and all the pundits in 2016 and won. And like he got more votes, I think, in 2020 than any Republican had ever gotten for president before. So sure, he lost, but like, let's not diminish the fact that he was able to win a pretty stunning victory in 2016.
And I was just talking to Jake Wilkins, former Ron Johnson press secretary, back at the RNC, in the 60 of us that were in the press shop, which is the folks that do the booking and deal with folks, and then the rapid response and research department, like what Liz worked in way back when, and what I did, a few years ago as a lowly staffer. There were only of 62 people to select Trump to win in 2016 of the RNC. So he had to have some knowledge, bucking the trend of the 2012 autopsy report, to just go full into hate that he had a finger on some pulse.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about his gross votes, though, as being the highest of any Republican, if you look as a percentage, he got a lower percentage than Mitt Romney did in both 2016 and 2020.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. The guy won 2016. He clearly tapped into something, but I think it does go to show you that sometimes we in the political consulting industry sometimes ascribe a little too much importance to like gaffes and how much they penetrate.
Well, let me ask you a somewhat related question. Liz, you're talking about the value of being out there and being part of the narrative and having exposure. While the risk is, gaffes and misstatements, one way that campaigns can get around that is through advertising, because they have complete control over what's said in the ads, and they can, pay for airtime. But I've noticed sometimes that overexposure in advertising can be a problem. I think there's been some races. I'm thinking the one in Maine, where I was living around the time of the Senate race in 2020, where it seemed like the amount of advertising was actually hurting the candidate that was spending so much on paid media, Sarah Gideon. Do you think that there's a difficult balance to strike even with the most controlled exposure of messaging? Can you be overexposed even when you have complete control, like in advertising?
I mean, it's possible. And I think that can especially be a problem if you're not talking about the issues that really matter most to voters. And if they're just exposed to nonstop ads where they're talking to you about something that you don't see as the number one issue, and this is a big problem for a lot of people in elections, is, for instance, I live in New York, and right now when I turn on my TV, and after we record this because it's Monday night, I'm going to go turn on the Bengals Browns game. All the ads are going to be from the Congressional Leadership Fund, which is the Republican super PAC that is, trying to take out Sean Patrick Maloney in New York and Pat Ryan in New York and Malinowski in New Jersey. All of them are sort of like talking about crime and cash bail and stuff like that, which is a really big issue in New York, right? And it's something that's dominating earned media as well. But then I see the Democratic ads and they're all focused on abortion. And I'm like, my God, New York has some of the most liberal abortion laws in the country. And if you look at the polling, it's like inflation by far and away is the number one issue, followed by crime. And it seems sort of tone deaf to me when I just see abortion, 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 abortion. And I think that it could be off-putting to voters if they're just inundated with these messages that they don't think reflects their priorities, because it does sort of feed into an underlying narrative that sometimes is out there about Democrats that we're a little bit out of touch.
So how does that happen? More specifically, is this a consultancy bubble where folks are just talking to each other and maybe they're not getting outside information to check their, and we're not disparaging anybody, but I'm trying to see if this is a bubble, or is this more quote unquote groupthink, sort of, where Democrats want to be a one size fits all and not upset progressives?
I think it's groupthink, where it's just like when Dobbs came down, we did see sort of a surge of registrations and enthusiasm among the Democratic base that had not been there, before, and thinking that, it could be sort of a silver bullet in November, and forget a red wave, maybe we could have a blue wave. And that was sort of the attitude after Kansas and Pat Ryan winning in upstate New York, when in reality, no, it's a piece of the puzzle. But smart candidates out there, I would point to a couple candidates like Mark Kelly, the U.S. Senator in Arizona, who's in a tough race, Raphael Warnock in Georgia, who's in a tough race. Their campaign ads have focused, sure, they've gone out there and talked about abortion, but also talk about things that they're doing to lower seniors' healthcare costs. Raphael Warnock talks about how he was a leader on the CHIPS bill and all the jobs that that's going to create in Georgia, and even how he's helped peanut farmers in the state of Georgia. And it's really just important for Democrats to understand we really need to make sure that we're communicating about a range of issues and not just sort of throwing all our eggs in one basket. And there are some people who get so mad when we say that, and they say, oh, well, that's a straw man. No one's actually doing that. I guess I would just encourage them, come over to my apartment in the West Village and watch the Bengals game with me and tell me that there isn't a lot of truth to what I just said.
So we do have the Bengals game coming up. So we have one last question for you, Liz, here. So my theory of the case, Georgia stays Democrat, Arizona stays Democrat, Nevada goes Republican, because we had John Ralston on and he pretty much bagged on the candidate there, Cortez Masto. But I want to ask you about Pennsylvania. I thought there was no way that this stroke was going to impact the race. I thought that the interviews had been limited and the candidate had been making sense. And then I turned on the debate and I was stunned at the first two questions and really the whole thing. I was horrified as a Democrat, and I was getting all these texts from Democrats and Republicans saying the exact opposite stuff, ultimately coming down on there is no way anybody should have let him debate. So the question here is twofold. Should John Fetterman have debated? Should the campaign have caved to the pressure that allegedly they caved to? And regardless of whether or not he should have debated, will it mean anything? Because debates seem to not really matter that much.
They've gotten second guessed by so many people, and I have friends on that race, so I am not going to pile on and second guess them. They were sort of in a no-win situation. Either way, whether he debated, whether he didn't debate, they were going to get crushed in the media, and there are downsides to both approaches. But I ultimately think that John Fetterman it'll be close, but I think he'll be able to pull pull it out and win. And we might not know Tuesday night or whatever, just because before the stroke, and he was one of our stronger candidates. He is someone who has a really, really strong personal brand. And, going back to sort of what we were saying about, Tim Ryan, he's someone who defied a lot of the stereotypes about Democrats, right? Which is that, they're more comfortable in faculty lounges at donor retreats than they are with, working people. No, he's a guy who's obviously more comfortable in a union hall than he is in a faculty lounge. But he also was someone who was running like as his own sort of man. Like he's okay with bucking national progressives on issues like fracking. And he understood that in a tough year like 2022, that he had to go around to every single county in the state, which he did. He had a program, I think, called Every County, Every Vote, because he realized that like you can't just run up the margins in blue places. You got to try to dent Republican margins in red areas. And you've seen him get really, really impressive turnout for his events in red areas. And generally, you've seen him poll quite well among rural Democrats. And I think that's been something that has been sort of undercovered, that his fundamental strength as a candidate has been dented for sure by the stroke and, maybe by the debate performance, but a lesser candidate would not be able to survive that. And I think he will. I predict that he will be able to survive that in November.
I hope that you're right. Well, thank you very much, folks, for listening to our show with Lis Smith, author of Any Given Tuesday, A Political Love Affair. We will be back with our next episode on Tuesday, the day of the U.S. midterms. Doesn't really get much bigger than this. The outcomes will likely shape President Biden's last 2 years in office, and also what we're looking forward to in 2024.